Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Two oil-rich countries are up in arms this weekend, though you'll only be hearing about one of them elsewhere.
In the Sudan, or the half of it that's left after a foreign-sponsored sundering of the country north and south, a revolution is underway against the authoritarian military ruler General Bashir, who has been in power for 30 years.
Bashir is a regional hub for the pan-Islamic Muslim Brotherhood, though years of isolation and sanctions have pushed him ever closer to Saudi Arabia.
His people, it seems, may have had enough. Steep price increases of bread and other staples sparked outrage, and the protest movement is now challenging for state power.
Joining us today is Khalid Omar Yusuf, General Secretary of the opposition Sudan Congress Party. Welcome on board the Sputnik. The last time I met General Bashir was before his last presidential election, when he promised me solemnly that he wouldn't be standing. And of course, this whole uproar now in the country is because it's clear he was planning to go on and on, wasn't he?
Thank you, George, for having me here. Firstly, Bashir is not elected at the first place. He came to power through a military coup at 1989. Since then, Sudan has been ruled by one of the most brutal kleptocracy in the world, I believe. Since then, the regime of al-Bashir divided the country, sent the people, millions of people outside the country as refugees and inside as IDPs, killed hundreds of thousands of Sudanese. And what's going on now is accumulation for the 30 years of oppression against the Sudanese people. The Sudanese people prove one thing, that they are very determined to keep the resistance, whatever the brutality of the regime that is against them. During the last 30 years, people form different kind of resistance against the regime, peaceful resistance and even armed resistance. And after 30 years, I think it is time to change.
Now, he has always been able to count on the military, on the armed forces. He is a general, and as you say, that's how he came to power in the first place. But there comes a point in these situations when the army will no longer fire on the people. Have we reached that stage in Sudan yet?
Actually, army is not firing the people, but national security forces is firing the people. There are militias that affiliated to al-Bashir firing the people. Now the death toll is 50 people during the last month of protest. So there is firing against the people. There are many kinds of brutality to contain and to oppress the protesters. But I do believe the Sudanese people, by their peaceful means of struggle, defeat the bullets and fire of the armed forces that belong to Bashir.
So I believe it's widespread throughout the country, isn't it? Not just concentrated in the capital.
Actually, it's the most widespread revolution in the history of the country. We had two revolutions before it, 1985 and 1964, and it's tremendously different because, firstly, in 1985 and 1964, the protests started from Khartoum and ended in Khartoum. This revolution is different because it started from Damascene in Blue Nile state. The students of high schools went to street in Damascene at 13th of December. And the second city that followed Damascene was Al-Fashir, the capital of North Darfur state. So it started from outside Khartoum, and then it moves to Khartoum, and for more than 30 cities in Sudan. At Thursday, 24th of January, the protest that has been called by the Alliance of Forces signed the Declaration of Freedom and Change spread over 30 cities and villages all around Sudan at the same time. So it's wide spread, and I do believe we are very close to the point of ending the 30 dark years of al-Bashir.
And this alliance, what forces are in it and what forces are outside of it?
This alliance formulated from the opposition parties and the professional associations. There are two major opposition alliances, Sudan Call and National Consensus Forces. And there is a professional association who were the first entity called the people to go to street at 25th of December. Then after that, a declaration called the Declaration of Freedom and Change has been signed between the professional associations and Sudan Call and National Consensus Forces.
And who's outside? Anyone outside of any significance?
There are two armed movements outside this declaration, SPLM, Al-Hilu, and the Sudan Liberation Movement, Abdul Wahid. But nevertheless, we share the same calls, same calling. We have a kind of coordination to moving in the street, and we hope that by the time all of the Sudanese opposition forces will be under the same umbrella.
Now, one of the problems, many problems for Bashir, is that if he demits office and goes anywhere, and perhaps whether he goes anywhere or not, he'll be promptly arrested on the International Criminal Court indictments that are outstanding against him. Some have speculated that one way of making him demit office peacefully without further bloodshed is that the ICC should drop their charges against him and allow him to go peacefully into exile. You see any traction in that?
First of all, I believe that this is his problem. It's not our problem. But I can understand the debate about the relation between justice and peace, and justice and transition. For us, we do believe that there are no sustainable peace and transition without justice. So there are many forms of justice that could be, but the most important thing that you shouldn't sacrifice justice for any reasons. So the debate about the destiny of al-Bashir, as I'm saying to you, it could go anyway, but we are not going to sacrifice justice for any reason.
Now, he's still there, as we speak at least, so he clearly still has some strength, some alliance. What are his regional alliances? He has been recently growing closer to Saudi Arabia. A day or two ago, he was in Qatar. Does he have support from the Gulf?
Actually, when the revolution started, people of Sudan felt that they have been letting down by the world because the global, also international and regional actors keep silent while Bashir is slaughtering the people in the streets. And this is, we can understand the reason behind that. Bashir, to keep his grip on power, tend to provide the regional forces with cheap services, sending troops to fight outside wars that we have nothing to do with, providing information for different security services around the world, and he keep giving these services in a very cheap price. So I do believe that there are many regional forces dream with al-Bashir to have more time in power. But all the time, the determined factor of change is the local factor, is the will of people. This revolution is not ignited because of any outside reason. There are no allies for the people of Sudan, actually. Yeah. They decide to take their destiny by their own, without help from any outside forces. At this time, I do believe the region and the world have two options: to ally with the people of Sudan, or to stand at the wrong direction, under the wrong stand of the history of Sudan. For us, Bashir is done. He will never continue as the president of Sudan. His regime can't keep the power. It's a matter of days, weeks, but the end result is clear for any Sudanese. Their end is come, and we hope, firstly, with the people of the world, to stand by the people of Sudan. Secondly, the governments of the region and the government of the international community to choose what the Sudanese people ask for. Sudanese people want change, want to live, want their dignity, want to live want to elect their leaders and have a government that represent their demands.
What timescale are we operating in here? Is 2019 Bashir's last year in power, or is this his last month? How do you see it rolling out?
Yeah.
No, nobody knows. Nobody knows. It could happen anytime. It could happen today. It could happen after a week. It could happen within months. But I'm pretty sure that we are approaching to the end.
The end game. Well, we'll see. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up next, the pirates of the Caribbean seek to board Venezuela. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. At my age, you give up thinking that there's anything new under the sun. But this week, the United States, Canada, and of course Albania afforded official recognition as president of Venezuela to a man who didn't lose the upcoming presidential election. He actually withdrew from standing in it.
Now that's surely a first. Normally in a coup like this, the world waits until those regime changed are either dead or fled.
Venezuela broke diplomatic relations with the US after Vice President Mike Pence announced the beginning of this coup. But Washington has refused to withdraw its diplomats from the country and threatened war if they are harmed.
Now Russia, China, Cuba, Mexico, and Bolivia are standing by the legal Venezuelan authorities. Neighboring Colombia is a candidate member of NATO, and Bolsonaro's Brazil has applied to join. The scene is set, therefore, for a new Ukraine or even a new Syria.
Joining us now is Ben Chacko, editor of the only left-wing daily paper in Britain, The Morning Star. Ben, welcome on the Sputnik. Hi. Before they dropped the bombs, they dropped the narrative, of course. And the narrative against Venezuela has been the longest bombing run in history. How have you felt as the editor of the only newspaper which has been printing the other side of the Venezuela story, about the fact that it's essentially wall-to-wall propaganda as a prelude to this attack? It's an aggression, isn't it?
It is an aggression, and it's been going on, as you say, for a very long time. The unrest in Venezuela, the opposition have never reconciled themselves to the Bolivarian revolution. We know there was an attempted coup against Hugo Chavez 16 years ago, and there have been repeated violent uprisings against President Maduro, despite both of his elections having been given a clean bill of health by international observers. So we saw a huge wave of violence in 2014, a wave of violence in 2017 by right-wingers who set upon Chavez supporters, Chavistas, as Maduro supporters are also known, setting people alight, beating people up. People were being killed in quite large numbers. And yet in the West, all of that was presented as government repression of protests, even though we have had videos of soldiers saying we're overthrowing the government. We had an attack on the Supreme Court with grenades by opposition figures. And when the government attempts to restore order in those circumstances, it's accused of repressing somehow legitimate protests. So there has been an absolute propaganda war to delegitimize the elected government of Venezuela.
Now, we expected something like this, but not quite this. As Gayatri was saying in the introduction, they normally wait till they've killed the president or forced them to flee before recognizing someone else, or they recognize a defeated candidate in a disputed election. They have a problem with that because Jimmy Carter, no less, has repeatedly adjudicated Venezuelan elections as the best on the planet. But they normally wait. Here we have some guy in Caracas declaring himself the president, swearing himself in, and countries are actually recognizing this.
Well, I think we've seen a number of different tactics used by the right in Latin America when they haven't been able to get their way at the ballot box. So we've seen in Brazil the way that there was a constitutional coup against the Workers' Party president, Dilma Rousseff, and then an election in which the Workers' Party's most popular candidate was not allowed to stand, which has resulted in the far-right government we have in Brazil now. And in Ecuador, we had Lenin Moreno posing as the successor to Rafael Correa, and then being elected on a platform to continue the revolution, but once in power, starting to reverse it.
Despite his name.
Despite his name. So, although it is a surprise what's happening.
And in Argentina, of course, where the criminalization of the Kirchner era is well underway.
Combined with the persecution of indigenous rights activists in Argentina, which, again, we're starting to see in Brazil and in other Latin American countries.
But it has been this process of judicial coups against elected politicians. But this is new, I insist, because I personally, after 50 years in politics, have never seen anything quite like this. Do you expect the European Union, NATO, Britain to follow Trump and Pence down this path?
Well, we've already seen statements from the European Council President Donald Tusk and from Guy Verhofstadt essentially saying that the European Union should recognize the Juan Guaido as the new president, despite the fact that he has no constitutional claim to that position. But we also have seen a more cautious line, I think, from the French and British governments so far, although they have certainly not defended the elected government of Venezuela. They have so far refrained from recognizing Juan Guaido as the president. So I think there is an element of caution there. We saw reports that were leaked last year that the Trump administration had been in talks for quite some time with dissident officers in the Venezuelan army about the idea of a coup in Venezuela. But the military in Venezuela have remained loyal thus far to the revolution. And the experience, I suppose, of a long-running campaign of destabilization has meant that the Venezuelan government has tried to mobilize its very widespread popular support in the country against a coup. We know that people flocked to the streets and defeated the coup against Hugo Chavez. So I think that this tactic is evidence that they haven't been able to get rid of Maduro. They tried to get the military to remove him. They've tried all sorts of dirty tricks, but they've failed, and that's why they've gone for this rather novel approach.
So who is he? Who is he? We know nothing of him. Why did he withdraw from the first place?
It's quite funny. All these experts on Syria, Ukraine, Russia, and so on are all scrambling in taxis to the studios, and they can't even pronounce his name. They know nothing about him.
Well, he's a member of the Popular Will Party, which presents itself as a centrist party, but I think it's very far from that. It's been implicated in a lot of the violent uprisings against the government, and it publicly welcomed the Bolsonaro election recently, saying that this was an opportunity for Brazil to intervene in Venezuela. We know that Bolsonaro has said that he will wipe out the Reds in Brazil, that he will, he has said the only problem with the Brazilian military dictatorship was that it failed to kill enough left-wingers. He sees himself as the leader of a real counter-revolution that will purge Latin America of socialists and so on. So I believe this is a continuation of what we've seen in other Latin American countries. They see Venezuela as the prize.
Colombia has a border with Venezuela. It's a candidate member of NATO. Brazil has applied to join NATO and said that Bolsonaro said he'd be ready to talk about American military bases in Brazil. So the internationalization of what's happening in Venezuela is a very real prospect. Meanwhile, as Gayatri said, Russia, China, Cuba, Bolivia, Mexico are all standing by the legal authorities. So it's not an exaggeration to say we could be looking at another Syria in Venezuela.
I don't think it is. I mean, we know that the US has a very close relationship with the Colombian government that has gone through a very difficult peace process, but still that large numbers of former left-wing paramilitaries and left-wing candidates in the elections in Colombia are being killed all the time, that the US is able to use Colombia potentially as a basis for attacking Venezuela. We know the Brazilian government has actually, Bolsonaro has said he will happily harbour Venezuelan oppositionists, train them on Brazilian territory for an intervention against Venezuela. So I think it's really important for us on the left in Britain, for the Morning Star, to be emphasising what a disaster these interventions have been wherever they have taken place, and that a war to remove the Venezuelan government is absolutely illegitimate, and we have to do everything we can to prevent it happening and to prevent Britain's government from being complicit in an American attempt to change the regime in Venezuela.
Given Trump's problems at home with these investigations getting ever closer to the Trump family syndicate, this is a kind of wag the dog war, isn't it? It's look over there. And so far, the liberals, centrists, even the left to some extent in Venezuela, have not felt confident enough to respond.
Yeah, I thought it was quite, sudden. Everything happened so sudden overnight. Is it coincidental, the timing of this?
Well, I haven't
president?
heard anything yet from Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or anyone denouncing this. Have you?
I haven't either, and the left in the US Congress has often been rather weak on international questions such as this one. I wouldn't necessarily say it's simply an exercise in distraction. We know that the United States has been consistently hostile to the Venezuelan government, that President Obama ludicrously declared Venezuela a security threat to the United States, and that Trump
Obama and Trump, the policy has been more or less the same.
And it's been escalated by Bolton, of course, talking about this troika of tyranny and saying that he wants to see Venezuela
axis of evil. Lastly, one of the difficulties for the left in Britain will be that this situation will now be used as yet another stick to beat the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, won't it? He's been very close to the Bolivarian revolution, particularly in the Chavez period. They'll be dusting down old videos and quotes as we speak. How do you think that's going to play out?
I think that any attempt to distract Jeremy's supporters by raising this international issue will probably backfire. There have been so many attempts to do this that the very overwhelming support for Corbyn in the Labour Party is going to see through anything like that. But there is certainly a risk that if the British government decides to join in any kind of international adventurism in Venezuela, we know that the Defence Secretary has been talking about setting up military bases in Latin America, as well as in the Far East, that there will be a phalanx of Labour MPs who will be prepared to go along with that to defy Jeremy Corbyn, who would, I presume, stand for a peace, stand for
peaceful resolution of this
conflict, and who will attempt to throw their weight behind Theresa May and any forces in the British Parliament that are prepared to support a counter-revolution in Venezuela.
Well, it's a useful distraction from their Brexit problems, that's for sure. Ben Chaco, editor of the wonderful Morning Star, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So we simply asked, what is going on from Venezuela to Sudan? And Fra Hughes answers, echoes of Miran Square, another fascist coup in the making. From Allende to Cuba, sanctions and interventions to end socialist elected governments. Shame on America and for us for allowing it to happen again. And Aaron Lewis quotes Ban Ki-moon saying in January 2012, in Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, South Sudan, Yemen, and Syria, by our words and actions, we demonstrated that human protection is the defining purpose of the UN in the 21st century.
It's very interesting. The UN is completely not present in this picture. The United States and Albania, mighty Albania, and I've no doubt Ukraine and other close allies of the United States will follow them down this road, which is perfectly absurd. It's the recognition of a man who didn't lose an election. He didn't even stand in it. He just said, I'm the president, and countries are recognizing him. You couldn't make it up.
Nope, you could not. And that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on our social media, on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvelous.